We need to somehow find a way to record that, don't we? I kind of feel like that needs to be a thing.
I think it's fine without.
So my sadly, as you all know, my house is the house that was built by the first little pig. So sorry for the background noise as somebody moves and the thing sways and creaks.
Can't hear a thing.
Do you want to move the mic
freaking
slightly
okay.
closer to your face?
Like there.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, good. I've moved it slightly closer to my face. Right, let's go then. Welcome back, gents.
Evening.
Hi, Rob.
Well, wasn't week one the week that didn't disappoint? And as much as we're going to be getting into the week one storylines, our highs and lows and the bits we loved, we've also got week two to look forward to. We're on the verge of Thursday night football as we record, and we're going to look through to the full slate of games across the weekend. But firstly, gents, quick round the room. What were your thoughts around a lively and entertaining week one? Aldrin, let's kick off with you.
It was just a bit out of the blue, some of those games, I thought. The Texans game was bizarre. I know we've talked them up as being the worst team in football for best part of, I don't know, all year. And then they suddenly turned up and put on a show. There was a lot of high scoring games, which I was surprised by. But yeah, overall, I thought it was, I don't know, it was a great way to be back with football. I thought it was, yeah, spectacular. Some really good games, really interesting storylines with some of the players, particularly the rookies that I thought a lot of them performed really well and looked like they've settled in quite nicely. So yeah, overall, I mean, it was just great to have football back, wasn't it? So amazing.
Absolutely agree. JB.
Yeah, I think, yeah, just it being nice to have football back is kind of the summary of it. It was just so good to see fans in the stands, to see games being played, to see excitement going there. Yeah, as we've called out kind of the Texans, we have to give plaudits to Phil for being the only one of the four of us to predict that the Texans would win, whether that was because he had faith in the Texans or he just figured he'd disagree with all of us and that way he had a better chance of winning in the end. But yeah, just it was a bit of a surprise for some of it. I think we didn't see the Texans game going that way. What on earth happened in the 49ers and the Lions game? Because that went from, and Rob and I think Phil talked about this on Sunday when we were watching the games. The Lions seemed to have come out and just decided they were going to do all sorts of wacky stuff instead of just doing the basics. And then to come that close at the end of it, what was it? An offside recovery, a touchdown with a 2-point conversion, a failed offside recovery, but then a fumble when Debo onside. A fumble for Debo Samuel when all he needed to do was just go down. And we'd just seen Christian McCaffrey do the exact thing they needed to do in the Carolina game. It was absolutely mental. It's the kind of stuff that you're just not going to get in a lot of other sports. It's that kind of excitement. And then obviously we had Monday Night Football, which I personally loved.
We will have Ravens fans listening to this podcast who are picking up on a slightly divisive tone there, mischievous tone, let's call it that, JB.
I think anybody that's listened for long enough will know precisely where James's loyalty is.
The rest of us will balance that out, listenership, please don't worry. And PB, takeaways from week one?
Yeah, for me, I think it was one of the storylines going in was how would Jameis Winston do, isn't it? And he ended up throwing no picks, 5 touchdowns, only 150 yards. So it's not like he had a massive game through the air. I think they were carried, on the run, but he was safe with the football. And I think
one of his touchdowns travel 50 yards, though.
50 yards
in the air.
Yeah. So that's a third of the yards he got in the game in one touchdown. But I think that the encouraging thing for the Saints is he was safe with the ball. And there are going to be tougher tests ahead than what was a woeful Packers performance. And I'd be amazed to see them play that bad again this entire season. But I think that was encouraging. As James said, it was good to see fans back in the stands. It was good. There were a lot of interesting games, a lot of storylines to take away. A fair few injuries as well. I remember last year there were a lot of early superstar injuries, and I'm not sure there have been, that many devastating injuries so far. Thinking, Saquon Barkley going down last year, Kittle got hurt early, McCaffrey, nothing on that scale, but still, a fair few injuries I thought this weekend. So it's be interesting to see how those teams recover.
Yeah, injuries might become a bit more of a storyline, I suppose, with the slightly longer season, shorter pre-season, kind of still that rumbling this year, I guess. But yeah, my takeaways, very similar to you guys, really. Aldrin, your primary point that there were a lot of surprises. I think week one gives you at least that possibility, doesn't it? You know, these things tend to correct themselves as the season goes on. And actually that theme of week one surprises is going to lead to our hot topic chat later. Once we've done our games of the week and predictions, we're going to be talking about which team looked too good to be true in week one and was our week one mirage. So that definitely feeds into content later in the pod. But you know what the weird thing is I think that some of the results heap an awful lot of pressure on good teams now in week two. You know, you kind of look at some of these teams who had surprising losses in week one, who are suddenly up against tougher opponents in week two, and you think, well, crikey, 0-2, 0-3. You know, you start to look at some of these good teams who, if they're not careful, could find themselves a bit of a hole to dig themselves out of, and probably none more so than the Packers. I mean, my takeaway from week one was absolutely that Aaron Rodgers storyline kind of coming crashing down around his ears. You know, how disruptive was he? How much is this the impact of what's gone on in the offseason in Green Bay between Rodgers, ownership, head coach, general manager, and so on? But I mean, there's bad performances. And I honestly think this performance is so bad, I think it'll be a footnote on his career. You know, I think for all the great things he's done, and no one will ever take that away, first ballot Hall of Famer, one of the best to ever play the game. But I do think this game will be remembered. You know, I think that QB rating, single-digit QB, he's just unheard of for anyone of that ilk, let alone Aaron Rodgers. So, yeah, my takeaway was really how that played out in Green Bay. I'm so glad in our fantasy draft I grabbed the number one rated wide receiver in football with my first overall pick. His 3 points last week was a gift. Thanks to Auntie Adams. So in terms of week one, loads of surprises. JB, you've nailed something though, which will come up in a theme I'm going to talk about later. Trick plays in week one. For me, trick plays in week one, as much as you're right, it nearly worked for the Lions. They made it exciting for a home crowd. Trick plays in week one screams of teams who just can't do the basics right. Screams of teams who can't move the ball on the ground, can't move the ball in the air. And actually, yeah, as fun as it was, I just wonder how life will be for teams like the Lions and the Jets and teams like that moving forward. But anywho, if that is our key takeaways from week one, as much as it was a quick round the room, let's kind of keep on the themes of week one while nudging ourselves ahead to week two. So you've all got a game of the week. I want to know what you think the key matchups within that game will be, the key storylines you're looking out for. And then at the very end, you can even give us your winner and which team you're putting into Club Dub. So as we go around the room in our traditional order, that means, Aldrin, we're starting with you. What have you got for us as your week two pick?
Well, my pick this week is the 49ers against the Eagles. And I think this is one of those matchups that kind of goes back to some of those surprises that we talked just about, really. The Eagles, I mean, we've talked at length over the offseason about how, you know, we think they've been in a bit of disarray. The team's not really set. Is Hurts really a QB1? And is he going to step up? And I think he answered a lot of those questions, or certainly in week one. Like you said, things can balance themselves out over the year, but certainly week one, Hurts looked really good. That offense looked exciting. The link up between Hurts and Devonta Smith looked impressive. You know, they kept that kind of relationship from college and just jumped straight into the NFL, and that looked really good. Had Jalen Reagor back fit, and he looked like he could contribute. And yeah, overall, I think the Eagles were one of the surprise packages of the week. On the other side, you've got the 49ers, who probably looked for 3.5 quarters the team as advertised. You know, they put up big points early. Garoppolo was efficient, consistent with the ball. They moved it downfield well, got into the end zone well. Deebo Samuel was fit and looking like an absolute game breaker. So the interesting thing for me is just how everything plays out in week two. Does it settle down? Do the Eagles kind of get back into a bit of funk that they had last year? Can the 49ers kind of stem the tide of those, like James said, mental errors, mistakes, silly fumbles, silly giveaways, and see out a game confidently? I think the couple of key matchups for me is Deebo Samuel against Big Play Slay. I mean, that's going to be an interesting one to watch. Deebo went off, I think it was 180 yards and a touchdown last week. Slay, is one of the most underrated cornerbacks in the league. I think he's always been exceptional, and he keeps big time receivers in check. So that'll be an interesting one to watch. And then the other bit for me to watch is how Hurts and Emmanuel Sanders do. Not Emmanuel Sanders.
Miles Sanders.
Miles Sanders, sorry. How Miles Sanders and Jalen Hurts do on the run, because they both look impressive last week and put up some decent numbers. And the 49ers were pretty weak against the run last week, against the Detroit Lions, who for the last few years haven't been great running the ball. I think the 49ers gave up 5 yards a carry, which against dynamic receivers in Sanders and particularly Hurts last week, who showed that kind of dual threat ability that we talk about with, some of these kind of exciting younger quarterbacks, will be interesting to see if they can kind of slow them. So I think it's going to be a really good game. It could be quite high scoring, and it'll be, a fascinating matchup, I think.
I love the pick. I can't remember. I mean, obviously myself, JB and PB watched week 1 red zone in each other's company. And there was a point where we had a conversation about the Eagles, and you've just said it. I don't know. I'm not Hurts' biggest fan. I do think he did good things last season, particularly against the Cardinals, actually, ironically. But while the world's getting very carried away with rookies, and also Joe Burrow seemed to get a lot of plaudits at the weekend, I thought Hurts was maybe the most impressive of those quarterbacks that we were looking to make the step. I thought he looked mobile enough that he could cause a lot of teams problems. I think your pick of the matchup is absolutely, for me, the success of this game, I think, will be decided more, can the Eagles offense be kept in check by the 49ers defense rather than the other way around? I think the 49ers need to be good against mobile quarterbacks, being in the NFC West, but it'll be interesting to see how Hurts does against what I think is slightly better opposition. But I'm with you. I think you've called all the key points, but I think maybe I have maybe not judged Hurts too sternly, but maybe didn't expect what I saw in week 1, and will be curious to see if it carries over, just as you said.
My only caveat with him, sorry, I was going to say my only caveat with him is we saw those types of performances last year, just in fits and spurts, and then it didn't translate into consistency last year with Hurts. And that was my caveat with him last year. I thought, like you said, in particular games and in particular situations, he looked good. But sometimes when it wasn't going his way, he didn't look as impressive and he looked like he struggled. So that's the only thing. And that's why I'm interested to see how it goes this week.
And I've been with you, but I actually think, I'm not saying he will. I think this is the seesaw moment where we might find out more in week 2. But he's had a full off season. He didn't start last season as the starter. There's a lot of things that, you could start to build a narrative to say maybe they have uncovered a bit of a gem there in Philadelphia. And maybe they have completely changed the outlook of their season. But anyway, sorry, JB, I think I cut in there with more points when you were ready to rock and roll.
That's right. I think the Eagles were kind of the antithesis of what we were talking about with the Lions, because I think when we were watching on Sunday, the Eagles were the team that we called out for doing the basics. They were lining up correctly. They weren't trying any kinds of trickery. They weren't trying to overdo like the razzle dazzle to try and trick anybody into the Falcons into going for anything. Whereas as we saw with the Lions were running trick plays from the first quarter. And when you look at that, you've got to think, well, hang on a minute, what kind of team are there? I think the Eagles looked good, but the Eagles looked good by doing what they needed to do to win. They didn't do anything more. They didn't do anything less. They just inhabited that nice zone in between the both of them. And I think it's going to be interesting to see where they go with that. I think that the connection between Smith and Hurts is going to be interesting to see. And it's going to be interesting to see how Hurts grows as a quarterback, because I think based on last week's performance, you've got to look and say, right, if he can keep going like that, those calls that existed for Gardner Minshew to be given more of a consideration, those calls potentially for the Eagles to be the landing destination for Deshaun Watson will get quieted down as well. And you kind of got to look at it from a sense of, well, quarterbacks are judged by wins. Rightly or wrongly, fairly or unfairly, that is what you judge a quarterback on. And if the Eagles keep winning, you can't really make an argument against that. And it's kind of what they need to do. They need that stability that he was providing last week.
Absolutely. PB, any thoughts before we go back to Aldrin for his club dub pick?
I think we're in danger of this, going into that section later of who was the, I can't remember the word you used. I'm going to say who was the fraud of week one, but
Mirage.
Mirage.
Week one mirage.
Yeah, that sounds a lot better than a lot less serious than a fraud of week one. But I don't know. I thought Hurts looked all right last year in the games that he played. He came in and he looked a lot better than Carson Wentz, and I'm not surprised to see them do well, as they did. The Falcons, I think, was the biggest surprise for me. They looked terrible, putting absolutely no points up, really. You wouldn't expect that with the offense, with Matt Ryan, who was the top 5, I think, quarterback in terms of yardage last year. All right, they lost Julio, but they added Kyle Pitts, who was arguably the most naturally talented player in the draft this year. And I think everybody thought he was going to go off, and it just didn't happen. So are they going to click? Week 2 they're playing the Bucks, and that's for another story, another day. But we'll see what happens with the Falcons there. But they're the biggest story coming out of this. I mean, you don't know. I think the Eagles look good, but me personally, I'm not sure they're going to beat the Niners, who also look good, apart from a couple of silly mistakes towards the end of the game. You can eradicate mistakes. You can't eradicate playing badly. And I think the Falcons were just so bad that the Eagles did look good. So it's going to be interesting to see them come up against the better team this week.
Yeah, I think the other thing, it's an interesting comparison, isn't it, when you look at the Falcons against the Eagles, that on paper, I mean, both those rosters have holes, but there are high points. There are talented people on both sides of the ball in those football teams. But also, of course, new head coaches. And I think Nick Sirianni, I mean, they looked organised. They looked really well organised and ready to go, the Eagles. And like you say, the Falcons, who, arguably got the bigger name, by being able to get Arthur Smith from the Titans. I just don't know. They just didn't look at the same level at all. I think this is a tough one for you to call here, Aldrin. We've obviously been more focused on the Eagles, been a bit more of a week one surprise. But I think the 49ers, Phil, you nailed it. You can clean up errors, but there's obvious talent there. You could be seeing the Eagles here against a team, well set up to go deep into the playoffs. So, Aldrin,
don't forget, this is a team that, are only one season removed from being in the Super Bowl. And they had a lot of injuries last year. Let's not forget that. I know there's a bit of a quarterback controversy in terms of they've got Trey Lance, who looks really good, and is he going to replace Garoppolo? And Garoppolo obviously dropped the snap on the first play of last week, which didn't make him look too good. But it's a team as you said, it's a team with a lot of talent. And if they get a bit better luck with injuries this year, and I know they've just lost Mostert for the season, which but then they've got 2 good running backs in young running backs in Sermon and Mitchell, so they're a strong team, and I could definitely see them going deep in the playoffs.
Yeah, incredibly well coached as well, aren't they? I mean, you feel like Shanahan's one of those coaches who could do something with almost any playing staff. Do you know what? I think this is a close one. Aldrin, give us your prediction for your game of the week and who you're going to put in Club Dub.
So I'm bang on with all of your points just there, really, in that I totally agree with Phil. I think you can clean up mistakes. I think mistakes in week one are easy to come by. And we talk about, they fumbled, they made silly errors. But ultimately, that happens a lot with a lot of very good teams when you're 20, 30 points up in going into the fourth quarter, complacency, maybe, a bit of week one rust. So I don't think it will be that close. I think it'll be an exciting game, but I do think that the 49ers will have more than enough to beat the Eagles. So my pick for Club Dub this week is the 49ers.
Nice. So the San Francisco 49ers, regrettably for those of us following teams in the NFC West, are the first team in Club Dub in week 2, which means, JB, I'm now chucking over to you for your game of the week.
So I am going with Sunday night's main event. Alan Chris will be there to call the action. it is the Kansas City Chiefs at the Baltimore Ravens. And kind of as a little bit of a peek behind the podcast for all of our listeners, I set the schedule for everybody to pick from on sort of Monday afternoon and had already isolated the Chiefs and Ravens as the game that I wanted to talk about. Because I figured looking at it as a week 2 game that could be what we are watching in the AFC Championship game or potentially just spreading a wider net, at least in the playoffs, it was a great opportunity to look at 2 teams who we expect to be contending for that Super Bowl position for the AFC, 2 teams that have been dominant forces in the AFC. And then Monday Night Football happened. And that changed the narrative, I think, a little bit for me, because what we've now got is, instead of 2 AFC powerhouses looking to keep on rolling, we've got the Chiefs team who took a little bit of time to get going against the Browns. And that says a heck of a lot more about the Browns than it really does about the Chiefs, because I think the Browns played excellently and to a degree deserved to win that game, I think, based on performance. But ultimately the Chiefs won. And a Ravens team that I was the only one that had the Raiders winning that game in our predictions. And part of that was just because I was trying to get a bit in for the year of not picking the Ravens. I never actually expected the Raiders to win. Sorry, Raiders fans, if anybody's listening. I think they'll take the win. I don't think they're worried about your opinion. I mean, even in our WhatsApp thing, when we were talking about it on Monday morning, I had identified the fact that I thought I was going to finish 11-5 because I'd already counted the Raiders out. So now we're looking at a Ravens team that have got a rebound from that. They've already lost they lost Gus Edwards. They've lost Marcus Peters. That's it. They've got questions along their offensive line there. I think Ronnie Stanley had a bad game on Monday, and he wasn't even the worst part of that offensive line. Hello, Alejandro Villanueva, former Pittsburgh Steeler. You got to look at that kind of matchup and think, well, that's that kind of Chiefs front with like Frank Clark and Chris Jones especially. They could feast on that. And then all of a sudden you've got Lamar Jackson, who's running for his life, but not in the good way that Ravens fans like. It was a very un-Ravens game. And it's going to be really, really interesting to see how they rebound from that. And to a degree, there is no worse team that they could be coming up against than the Chiefs for that, because the Chiefs aren't the kind of team that you want to go up against when you're trying to rebound. However, it was also a very unlike Chiefs game. And I think the Browns showed a little bit of how you beat the Chiefs by just piling the pressure on, by not taking their foot off and just keeping on going and keeping on going and keeping on going. Very, very reminiscent of how the Buccaneers beat the Chiefs in the Super Bowl last season. So now the Chiefs are looking at rebound from everything as well. And there's just so much within that kind of goes from, this could be the AFC Championship game just as much as this could be the end potentially of a team's season. Because if the Ravens go 0-2 in a division where the Steelers could potentially go 2-0, the Browns are potentially going to bounce back, the Bengals could go 2-0, all of a sudden now you're thinking, well, the records don't show it, and we know that the Ravens aren't the worst team in that division. But are the Ravens the worst team in that division?
I think they're helped a little bit like the NFC West on the other side by the fact that there's that extra wildcard spot now. I think my attitude, if I was a Ravens fan, would be not to panic. I think you don't need to be as good as the Chiefs in September. You need to be as good as the Chiefs in January. I do think, though, that when you look at the 49ers and say, they clean up their mistakes, they're a very good football team and they'll cause people problems, I do put the Ravens in that bracket. I think they've got X-factor talent in certain positions. But I will say that I think those were very uncharacteristic mistakes from a Baltimore Ravens team. You think about John Harbaugh, kind of in a similar mold to maybe a Sean Payton or to an extent a Bill Belichick, that teams are well prepared, that teams are physical. It was a bizarre game though, wasn't it? I mean, I said the Raiders needed that win, on our last podcast, and God, did they desperately need it. I thought it was a great spectacle, actually, probably one of the best Monday night footballs in a very, very long time. But I do think it was odd. I think, you hear coaches talk all the time about turnovers, and goodness me, turnovers in overtime are always going to be a killer. I don't worry for the Ravens, but I do think they'll come out of this weekend 0-2. I mean, as much as we saw, an odd performance from the Ravens on Monday night, the other thing I haven't mentioned that I took away from week 1 is just how ordinary some of these teams look. And I think even a really messy Ravens are a step or two ahead of a number of the teams we saw. But
so I think when you look at their schedule, you mentioned about them being 0-2. I think it changes a little bit this season, doesn't it, with the extra game on the season, that you don't need to panic so much so early. But their next 2 games are the Lions and the Broncos, and I know the Broncos won. Yeah, so I mean the Giants didn't look great, so I think the Broncos can be there for the taking for a team that you would expect to be as good as the Ravens. The Lions, I think, look poor, so you'd expect them, even if they do go 0-2, which you'd expect them to then be 2-2 by the end of week 4. So when they then come into the Colts in week 5, so it's not, I don't think it's dramatic. But yeah, turnovers and overtime, that's a game. We're talking about them being 0-1 and all, Ravens didn't look good, but we could just as easily be talking about them squeaking through against the Raiders, aside from that turnover that, it's just one unique play, isn't it? That it just happened to happen at the right time. But then do you need to look at the Raiders and think, well, maybe the Raiders are a good team this year. Maybe we've all underestimated them. I don't think so, but I guess we'll find out over the next few weeks. But the Chiefs were slow to start, and the Browns they got out far enough ahead that they should have just, closed the game out, really. I think, it shows how strong the Chiefs are that they came back and did it. And I think you'd expect them to beat the Ravens here. But then I think you almost expect the Chiefs to win every game, don't you? I mean, we did last year. They only lost to the Raiders, I think, last year in Kansas City. So, I don't think they've lost any of that strength. Kelsey, Hill and Mahomes are the big 3 for them. They probably need to get their running game going a bit more this year, I'd say. But, a hurting team like the Ravens coming off a loss like that, you never know, do you? But as it's a short week for them, coming from Monday to Sunday, I'd expect the Chiefs win.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Phil, you saying that the Chiefs need to get the running game going is when pundits said Man City needed to sign a centre forward and then put 6 past the team in the Champions League. Like either way, they're still going to smash teams that they play. I'll keep it brief. I think we talk about costly turnovers. I think Lamar Jackson last week, I think just tried to do too much. I think he felt the loss of those running back injuries and having a much weaker running back room, and probably put too much on his shoulders, feeling like he had to do it all, when in actuality, if he just kept it simple, they probably win that game. Like you said, Phil, we could have easily been talking about the Ravens just finishing out the game. Daniel Carlson doesn't make a 55-yard field goal in the last seconds of the game, then we're talking a different conversation, aren't we? So I think if I'm a Ravens fan, I wouldn't be too worried. I think they've got plenty in the bank. And again, kind of like the 49ers, very well coached team. They'll iron out some silly mistakes, and I think they'll go on and be a very good team. Chiefs, I really don't worry. Like you said, Phil, we expect them to win every game, and likelihood is based on what I saw, they probably will. Even when teams outplay them, they're still winning. They still got that X factor of Tyreek Hill and Kelsey, and just having Mahomes on your team always gives you a chance. So yeah, I don't think it'll be super close, but yeah, I would think the Chiefs are the winners here as well.
Yeah, my only addition, I suppose, before I let you go, JB, and it almost sounds like the most obvious thing in the world to say, only one of these teams is equipped to come back from a deficit, it feels like. We talked about that a little bit with the Ravens over the off-season. If one of these teams is 10 points down at half-time, I could see the Chiefs coming back from that. I couldn't see the Ravens. So I think the Ravens, off a short week and a bad start, would need to start fast and start well, and then see where they go from there. But yeah, I'm not really giving them much hope at all, actually. Maybe I should be a little bit more fair to the Ravens. But anyway, as we know, for your general dislike of any other team in that division, JB? I mean, it's a mystery. I'm going to throw back to you for who you might pick as your winner in that game.
I mean, you say it's a mystery as if all four of us haven't made exactly the same prediction. I have decided that I'm putting the Chiefs into Club Dub this week. I don't necessarily think it's maybe going to be the shellacking that everybody thinks it's going to be. It wouldn't surprise me if this is quite a close and competitive game. Like I'm not expected the Chiefs to sort of streak away with this, like Tyreek Hill taking a 75-yard touchdown down the field or anything like that. But I still think the Chiefs will take this.
The Ravens going 0-2. Like you say, Phil, be interesting if they don't get themselves back to 2-2 in a couple of weeks' time, and it does kind of go that way. I wonder what feelings will be like in Baltimore then. But yeah, two teams in week 2 now in Club Dub. So we've got the Chiefs being our second choice, following in the 49ers. And PB, what game of the week are you going for?
So for me, I'm picking the Titans versus Seahawks game this week. And only 2 weeks ago, our good friend James Aldrin was telling me how the Seahawks were the worst team in the division. And then they go in week 1 and beat his Colts. So, you know.
Not saying a lot then, is it?
Well, maybe not.
You make a good point, Phil, because the other three teams in the NFC West are, no, they also really won handsomely. Yeah, there is a problem
division,
there.
Isn't it? A really strong division. But it's, it's a funny one, isn't it? I suppose it's going to be an interesting marker for the division because the Cardinals played them last week and the Seahawks played them this week. But I think the Cardinals made the Titans look so ordinary. And this is a team that, we were talking up, or a couple of us were talking up in the summer as being potential Super Bowl candidates, And now week 1 looking so poor as they did against the Cardinals, who missed the playoffs last year. It's who knows where they're going to go. And they could be another team that could be 0-2 by the end of week 2. And then what happens? It's on a knife edge, really. And it's that division, the Colts division, isn't it? I think we figured the Colts and the Titans were the top 2 there. Going to win the division. Jaguars and Texans are not going to do a lot. And as it turns out, the Texans are the team at the top of the division. Who'd have thought that? But there we go. So I think the Titans came up against a stellar performance, didn't they? Chandler Jones isn't going to get 5 sacks every week or whatever it was that he got. His stat line was incredible. And you're not always going to come up against the player just who is on form at the right time in the right place. Taylor Lewan, the left tackle, he's a Pro Bowl left tackle, has come out and apologised for his performance, said it needs to be better. The Titans aren't going to be as bad as they were last week. They're going to come out fighting. I think Derrick Henry was, the Cardinals just stop him running completely. So I expect him to come out and put a big performance up on the board. Julio Jones is probably going to come out and get, a couple of big catches, I'd say, to kind of really stamp his authority on the team. And then you look at the other side of the ball and the Seahawks. I don't rate Carson Wentz, as we've been over. I don't think he's a top 10 quarterback. Arguably, I don't know if he's a top 15 quarterback, but I don't think the Colts look particularly good in any area of the ball. So it's hard to say kind of how the Seahawks looked, really. I suppose running, the Colts were pretty good, but thumbs up from Aldrin there. But aside from that, so it's hard to get a gauge on where the Seahawks are after that game because you don't know what sort of team the Colts. I suppose it's the beauty of week 1, isn't it? And when we go on to talk about mirages again, but the Seahawks are one of those teams that I always think kind of hangs around and they don't look like they're going to be amazing, but then they're really well coached, they're well organized, and they kind of just, snuff out teams and stick in games and kind of take the win, just by being that kind of well organized and kind of stifling, I suppose, the stifling kind of teams, not letting teams put up 30, 40, 50 points on them. So it's going to be an interesting battle. But yeah, I can't see the Titans being as bad as they were last week or coming up against the performance, Rob, as you'll be happy to know, as well as the Cardinals played last week.
I think this is going to be an interesting game because this is almost the Seahawks being visited by the ghost of Christmas future. because the Titans, to me, feel an awful lot like a team built like the Seahawks used to be built. Very much on the run, with a quarterback who is known for being mobile and a running back who is known for sort of punishing runs, punishing defenders, and really just carrying the team on his back. Now, just before anybody overreacts to anything, I am not in any way comparing Ryan Tannehill's mobility to the dynamite in the legs that Russell Wilson has, but there is a similarity in their setup there that we have to acknowledge. I think the Titans suffered last week because the Cardinals just absolutely shut down Derrick Henry and kind of just had, like Phil's talked about, had their way with that Titans O-line, and the Titans weren't able to do what they usually do. They weren't able to ride Henry, to set up that play action that Tannehill performs so well and go from there. So in one regard, Titans rebounding from that is going to have to be, well, are you going to go back to what you've done, or are you going to try something new? I think it's interesting to see the Titans' first game without Arthur Smith calling the plays ended in a loss. Now, don't get me wrong, Arthur Smith's first game as a head coach for the Falcons also saw him taking a loss there. Whereas, or is it going to be just the Seahawks looking at that saying, we know how to beat them now? The Seahawks performance against the Colts, sorry, Aldrin, I thought was actually quite good. We saw an awful lot in terms of going through the air. We saw that amazing rainbow touchdown to Tyler Lockett in the red zone. The kind of things that the new offensive coordinator for the Seahawks, whose name I think is Shane something, apologies that I can't remember that either, very traditional for the podcast, that kind of thing where they're talking about letting Russ cook is like, well, if letting Russ cook is just letting Russ throw the ball like a normal quarterback would do and not have him scramble around for 15 minutes before he does anything, I think Phil could be right, and the Seahawks could actually be quite dangerous this season.
So I think, firstly, let's name check Shane Waldron, the offensive coordinator of the Seattle Seahawks, and then I can make my point.
Hey, Shane.
I'm sure he's a long-term listener. In terms of really the Titans, it's really bizarre, isn't it? I mean, on the one hand, they were caught in the trap of you can't run the ball when you're 2 scores down. You know, whoever your running back is, you know, when you start to fall behind by those kind of numbers, you know you're going to need to throw. And unfortunately, they just came up against a defense that was absolutely, zoned in on that quarterback, and it just absolutely fell apart for them. So I do think that was situational. I think a new game brings a new opportunity to build on that kind of base that they use the running game for play action, as you described, JB. But let's just play the other side of that coin for the Titans for a moment. If they don't get Derrick Henry rolling, they look very ordinary very quickly. Now they're aided by the fact that I think they're in a relatively ordinary division. I think the Colts were a bit of a disappointment, as Phil's already touched on. And I mean, that could get an awful lot better. But, you know, I don't necessarily see the Jags or the Texans feeling like the ready-made article this year either. So the Titans, I'm going to put it down to just being one of those situations where they fell behind against a team who just seemed to have the answer for all of their questions. Seahawks, the weird thing is I hear Aldrin and PB argue about this whole thing about the Seahawks. PB, I think the Seahawks are a really good football team, probably one of the top 10 in the NFC. I still believe they're the worst team in the NFC West. I think you said it. I think that division is that good. Who do you put them above? I think the 49ers, Cardinals and Seahawks are probably much of a muchness. There's not really a lot between them in terms of where you might predict they end up. The Rams being the class of the division, I suppose. But yeah, I mean, if the only thing I think after such a damaging week 1 loss, a bit like we've talked about with the Ravens, is if the Titans followed it up with another, that feels like a problem. Even this early in the season, I think that feels like a problem for a team that, you know, really did go out and get certain personnel to set themselves up to play a certain way. So I'm not sure it's an obvious one with an obvious winner, but one with more significant consequences for the Titans if they were to lose it. Let's say that.
Yeah, I'm kind of with you on all of that. And I kind of stand by my comment. I do think the Seahawks are the worst in that division. It doesn't mean that they're not a very good team. I just think the thing with the Seahawks is I know they beat us, but I still think some of the same old problems are still there. I don't think Russell Wilson was particularly secure behind that line. We were still able to get pressure quite comfortably. I mean, when you've got a quarterback like Russell Wilson, occasionally they beat you deep, and he beat us deep twice. And, they put up a couple of scores. So I think it'll be a really interesting matchup because, like you say, I think the Titans, if they're behind and they're not able to run the ball, they look ordinary. And I think that would have been the case last year as well. There was games where they didn't get the run going and they looked like an average team. And I still think that's the case because ultimately, as nicely as Tannehill runs that offense, he's not a world beater. He's not going to beat you in all facets of the game. He's not going to run the ball on his own. He's not going to throw dimes all the time. He's an efficient mover of the game in that offense. I think the one thing that probably works in their favor this week is that whenever you get Derrick Henry running, he steamrolls teams. And I think that could well be the case against the Seahawks defense this week. I think you could steamroll them. But yeah, I don't know. I think it could be close. I think it could be a really good game. So it's an interesting one to pick, Phil. But yeah, I'm glad I don't have to make the decision.
Well, PB, you do. Give us the third team of week 2 that finds their way into Club Dub.
I've picked the Titans this week. I know I rate the Seahawks, and I said they are that stifling kind of team, but I think the Titans played so bad last week. I don't see them playing that badly again. I think Derrick Henry's going to have a point to prove, and he's going to run all over them. So yeah, I'm going to put the Titans in this week.
Just tease it the whole way along, and then you're like, and after all of that, I think the Titans will win. Okay, all right.
Spend like 15 minutes talking about how great the Seahawks are. Someone suggests the Titans are good. Phil, can I shock you? I've picked the Titans this week.
Titans to bounce back. Wow, look at that. 3 games down. I will say this just around the kind of Seahawks chat off and tie it to another point. What a difference it makes when your quarterback, who was clearly unhappy going into the off-season, quiets down in March and isn't still going on in August. I think, the Seahawks could have found themselves in a Green Bay-like situation. But you know what? Good for them. I think they look pretty good. And I think with, like you said, Russell Wilson for me he's one of the top 5 quarterbacks in the NFL in most people's eyes. And I still think the guy's underrated. I think he's absolutely supreme. If they keep him happy and moving, who knows where they could end up. So it ends up with me to talk about our 4th game then. So I have selected the Buffalo Bills against the Miami Dolphins. And you know what? There's kind of a few themes we've already explored in other games. We've touched on this with teams like the Ravens, for example. Do you know what? If the Ravens are competing for a wild card spot with the Dolphins, how much better would that be if the Dolphins were to find themselves 2-0 at the end of Sunday and not 1-1? I think to get that kind of lead on a team like the Bills would be useful. I think the Bills will absolutely come back and still look the class of that division. But they didn't look like a team that had got themselves going last week, did they? I mean, if we talked about the Titans not getting Derrick Henry going, I mean, Diggs didn't really have much of an impact on the second half against the Steelers. And actually, the Bills, really unlike them, based on what we've seen in previous seasons, didn't come out of the locker room really firing at all. The Steelers look back to their best. I think I talked about how badly they needed a win in week 1, but my goodness, they did it with a certain amount of swagger and a certain kind of bullying nature that makes you think about those great Steelers defenses they've had over the years. But bringing it back to these two, so Bills against the Dolphins, where are the big battles? Well, I think this comes down primarily to the Bills offense, because for the Dolphins getting a win last week, they weren't high scoring. They scraped past a developing, rebuilding Patriots led by a rookie quarterback who doesn't look ready in my eyes, but look like he could be developed into a useful starter given, 6 or 7 games under center. So for me, the Bills offense clicks. I'm not sure the Dolphins have enough. The Bills offense doesn't click. I think the Dolphins are well balanced enough and sufficiently good on both sides of the ball to make them a really tricky team and a really tricky opponent for most NFL squads. So that's really it for me. Does the Bills offense find its mojo, or do the Dolphins go 2-0?
So I was quite high, I think, as we all were. We were quite high on the progress of the Dolphins sort of towards the end of last season. And that win against the Patriots didn't look good. Like it wasn't the kind of win where you look and think, oh yeah, that is the next big team in the East rising up. Yes, the Bills also lost last week, but the Bills lost to like one of the prides of the AFC, one of the absolute dominant team defenses that you'll see. But I mean, in all seriousness, it was kind of a defensive performance that led to that Steelers victory. But the Bills didn't look like a team that were potentially not what they were last year, whereas the Dolphins did. The Dolphins looked like they'd maybe start to figure it out at the end of last year. And while they'd been on their summer holidays, they'd forgotten it and they did all of their homework the day before it had to be handed in. So I think it's going to be an interesting game to see from here. I don't think the Patriots or the Jets are potentially going to trouble anybody for divisional titles. I think the Patriots looked potentially better than we'd expected, but still didn't look like the world beaters that we know them to have been previously. So I still think Bills Dolphins is going to be kind of who takes the division out of here. And like we talked about just now with the Titans and the Seahawks, this is very much like can the Bills get back on track quickly? Can the Bills show that what they were doing last week isn't what they're going to continue to do? They have learned from their mistakes last week and they've adapted to now take the victory this week.
Yeah, I like that. Like I say, for me, and just to be clear, I'm with you on that point. I think the Bills are the class of that division. I think they win that division. I think you put the Bills 0-2, 0-3, I'd probably still have them as favourites. I think for the Dolphins, though, that incentive of being, 2 games up on a number of their rivals already, those wild card rivals in the other AFC divisions is big for them. But yeah, absolutely agree with your points. So Aldrin, where are you on this?
I don't know. I wasn't maybe as down on the Dolphins as maybe you guys are. I know they weren't stellar, but they got the job done against what is typically any time Bill Belichick coaches a team, particularly against younger quarterbacks, he normally dominates them, takes them out of the game, and they all leave sad. Well, if I'm Tagovailoa, I'm leaving the game having won. I'm pretty pleased with that. Connection with Waddle looks pretty good. I think he looks like he's going to be a decent receiver in the league. They get Will Fuller back this week from his suspension, who adds that real deep threat and makes your defense think differently than maybe you do when you can compact the field a little bit. So yeah, I'm not as down on the Dolphins as maybe you guys are. I still think the Bills are like you said, the pick of the division. I think they're, one bad week in week one certainly doesn't a bad team make. And those players in that offense are exciting and dynamic enough to just go off in a game and absolutely destroy a team. So I think week one, mistakes can happen. You can be a bit sluggish and maybe not come out of the off season like you want. But I think from what we saw from Allen last year and that connection with Diggs, and they've got a lot of plenty of other offensive weapons, and certainly their defense is good enough to maybe keep the Dolphins in check to the point where you let Allen kind of win the game for you. So yeah, I think the Bills will have enough, but yeah, I'm not as down on the Dolphins as maybe you guys are. I think they'll be a good team.
Listen to me saying how bad it is the Dolphins only squeezed past the Patriots last week after 20 years of nothing like that. Anyway, PB, go on, give me your thoughts before I shove one of these teams into club dub.
Yeah, I think the Dolphins looked all right. I don't think I didn't expect them to be, slinging it, putting up a 50 burger on the Patriots or anything like that, but they won the game. And at the end of the day, that's all they need to do to make the playoffs. They were a nearly team last year, weren't they? They had the chance to make it in the final week and didn't. So just a small improvement should see them into the playoffs this year, you'd think. The Bills, I thought, looked really ordinary. I was really shocked by that because they looked good last year. And aside from running into the Chiefs, were a potential, playoff team, Super Bowl team. And I think we all expected them probably to come out and beat a Steelers team that was a little bit patchwork because they've lost, a fair few pieces, thinking Bud Dupree, half of their O-line either leaving or retiring. So just seeing the Steelers grind one out, I think was quite surprising to me. And again, it's almost like I said for the Titans earlier. I don't think the Bills are going to come out and be that poor again. I can see them coming out and really wanting to put on a show because, to make up for last week. But then with the Bills, it's the air, it's the air game. They've got no real running game. And I think, like I said earlier about the Chiefs maybe wanting to get the running game going a bit more this year. The Bills definitely do, Moss and Singletary. They're not a kind of, neither of them is a highlight reel running back that is going to win you a game, I don't think.
Moss wasn't even active last week, was he?
Well,
He was inactive.
There you go. So for me, I think that's the biggest worry for them. I think teams know that they're going to throw it and can game plan accordingly. And you're going up against arguably one of the best cornerbacks in the league in Xavier Howard. So it's going to be interesting. If Howard shadows Diggs all night, there's not a great deal else there for Allen to work with. So I think that's the worry for me, but I expect the Bills to come out and put on a show in this one to kind of prove any doubters wrong after last week.
Yeah, so let's put everyone out of the misery. I think Allen, do you know what? It's funny because I think it'll be a bit like the Steelers in week one. I think Allen needs a gutsy performance and needs to really drag that offense up to the next level. And I expect him to do that. I have visions of, Josh Allen in the end zone, absolutely hammering the ball into the ground with an enormous spike. The Bills need to be better on offense to beat the Dolphins, and the Bills being better on offense is exactly what I expect. I'd love to see something. Do you know what? It'd be interesting if we saw a better performance from the Dolphins, even in defeat this weekend. I think that would give me a bit more confidence they truly do have what it takes to be a playoff team. Stranger things have happened than the Dolphins winning, but I think, I think it's the Bills that I'm going to put into club dub. So with all of that done, we're going to go around the room with a quick little dig into our hot topic of the week. So we trailed it at the start. Our hot topic is really built on this. If you were an NFL fan watching regular season football a year ago, you would be living in a world where the Jacksonville Jaguars had just beaten the Indianapolis Colts and looked pretty good doing it. Now, in the weeks that followed, the Jags would not win another game in that regular season. So do we think there is a Jags amongst this year's teams? Is there a team in week one who looks stellar? And look, maybe they might not go the rest of the season without a win, but certainly aren't going to hit these heady heights again. So Aldrin, talk to me about the team you think were the week one mirage and have tougher times ahead.
Well, it's one from my division again, like last year, and it's the Texans for me. I know that they quote unquote looked good, put up 30 plus points, but I think we easily get sucked into remembering that they beat the Jacksonville Jaguars, who are, a very young, very new, very different team under Urban Meyer to, what they've been previously. It's a new way of life almost in Jacksonville. So I don't think that's, it's not a glowing indictment of the Texans' talent that they beat the Jacksonville Jaguars. And I don't know. I still feel like they feel like a patchwork of a team. They've got Mark Ingram, Philip Lindsay, just kind of chugging away. Neither looked great last week. I think Philip Lindsay got kind of end zone touchdown pass, but again, nothing special. And I was expecting him to have been the lead back in that room when, Mark Ingram's very much on the downward, I would say, after after a couple of years being a pretty elite player for, the Saints and the Ravens. But yeah, I don't know. I just think Tyrod Taylor looked good, but we've seen that all before where he looks good for week 1 and then fades and goes back into a shell, becomes that safe, efficient, frankly, boring quarterback that he is. So yeah, I just feel like there's too much of a weird patchwork. I think the head coach Cully will be chuffed that he's got a win on the board week 1, but I don't know. I can't see too many in their future. Maybe it's just me and I'll be proved wrong and, they'll come out of this, but I just think they've still got that whole Watson situation hanging over them. And I don't know, it's just a terrible organisation.
I agree on the Texans, but I think nobody expects them to. I don't think anybody's come away from that game and said, wow, the Texans are a good team. They could challenge for the playoffs. Do you know what I mean? I think it's more a review of how bad the Jags were than anything else. I'd agree on that.
The only thing I would say, and I wasn't as down on the Texans as others at times. I mean, I like their running back room. I think, I think they're probably about in as good a shape as they could have hoped to have been, really, with everything that's gone on in the off season and probably the season before. But I will say this, one thing that I saw in week 1 was a number of football teams I don't expect to be very good. And I think the Texans looked organised enough to beat those kind of teams. Maybe there will be the mirage and maybe it's all going to fall apart from here. But do you know what? I didn't see them try the ridiculous. I didn't see them try the odd. They just understood what they needed to do. They're efficient in the red zone. They somehow managed, Mark Ingram was definitely the lead back, but they somehow managed to use those 3 different running backs in distinctly different ways. And I think that's one of the keys to success for them this season and success with a small s. I'm like you, Phil. I probably don't see a winning season even for them. But if they can use the running backs in the right way, if they can be efficient elsewhere, they've got a chance of challenging a few more. So is the Texans your pick as well, PB? So Texans, I know you have another, right? So if that's Aldrin's mirage for week 1, who you're going with?
Yeah, I've been trying to look at a team that I think people have been talking up afterwards. And for me, I'm going to go with the Saints. And maybe that's more out of hope than anything else. But, they made Green Bay look bad. But maybe Green Bay just played bad and that's why they look bad. I think we've talked about Winston and him being safe with the ball and that being a bit of a surprise, but he didn't really have to do anything. They were up so much so early that they could just rely on that running game. And I think if you put a bit of pressure on them and start to make him throw it a bit more, we talked about the cast that he's got there in terms of, not having as good a supporting team as at the Bucks and Thomas being out as well. He's not got a great deal to work with. So I know it's stupid after just seeing him throw 5 touchdowns, but I wonder if that's the mirage. And, they've got a favourable matchup again, I think, in week 2, playing the Panthers. The Panthers beat the Jets, but the Jets were a poor looking team as well. So it's going to be an interesting one. But yeah, I don't know. I still think they'll probably win week 2, the Saints, but I don't think they're as good as maybe people think they are after week 1.
I'm kind of with you on that. Not maybe in the same way. I think they'll do all right this year, but I do get it. I mean, I think again, Winston having one good game, we saw plenty of that. We saw plenty of that in his time at Tampa Bay, and we've seen it in the past. He can have those games where he's sensational, and then something just flips next week, and his head goes down, he throws 3 interceptions and he's terrible again. So I do feel like this year they will have a lot more peaks and troughs. Maybe, Winston will have those games where he lofts a ball deep into the end zone and everyone goes, oh, well, Drew Brees hasn't done that for 15 years. So they're a brand new offense. They're so much more dynamic. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think he will have games where he chucks balls deep and looks great. And then he'll have other games where he's terrible and they really suffer. But yeah, I think they'll still be all right. But yeah, I'm kind of with you. I don't think there's I don't think there's enough to get super hyped about them taking a deep run in the playoffs.
My pick were going to be the Saints as well, although it's funny, like so many things, it's another aspect. I think the Saints, I don't know, I love Sean Payton. I love so much about what they do. I don't think they're well set up to come back from deficits again, come from behind and get. I think when teams know they've got to throw, I think that might cause them problems with Jameis Winston. I think seeing, I mean, it's funny because I will agree with something you've just said, PB. I wonder actually if Winston is the mirage more than the Saints. There's not a world where he has magically corrected his interceptions just because he sat on a bench in New Orleans for a year. I don't get that.
And he had LASIK.
Well, yeah. Eye surgery as well.
The thing with Winston though is we're talking about a guy who threw 15 passes last week or something like that. So we can't look at what he did in any fashion and judge that as a performance because there's just not enough of it there. Like I think Phil talked about right at the very beginning of this. This was a guy who threw 148 yards and 5 touchdowns. Don't get me wrong. If I was a Saints fan, I would be absolutely fine with that being the standard blueprint for the games every single week. Throw as little as possible, still score 35 odd points, absolutely stomp everybody. It's like, I don't know whether this is necessarily the Saints being a mirage or just maybe that we just don't have enough data on them yet.
I think, partly the argument is you haven't got enough data on anybody. It's kind of why we play this crystal ball element, I suppose. But yeah, the other thing that you just can't help is that the Saints look good against a team that absolutely imploded. Like historically imploded. Jameis Winston didn't throw all those touchdowns in a 10-point game. He threw those touchdowns against a team that on the other side of the ball just wanted, Groundhog Day, just wanted to wake up again and start all over and approach the game a second time. There are times when teams often get described as being humbled. The Packers were humiliated. Rodgers was humiliated. And maybe it's a bit unfair. It's maybe stating the obvious to go, the Saints won't go through the whole year, doing that to each and every team. I don't think that happens many times in a career for a player like Rodgers or a season for a team, whether you're the Packers or not. But yeah, I'm with you, PB. I think the Saints would have to be there almost through no fault of their own. I don't think they're dreadful by any means. They're certainly not this year's Jags, but yeah, I don't think they'll do that to many more teams. So if PB and I agree, that means, JB, you get to round out our show with your week 1 mirage. Who are you going for? Think those Steelers maybe looked a bit friskier than we'll see in week 2?
So there was a game that we discussed earlier where the three of you were quite complimentary about a certain team's performance. And I believe I kept quite quiet on that because I think my Mirage team plays in the NFC West and they play out of the city with the Golden Gate Bridge. They are the San Francisco 49ers. Because how could you let the Lions get back in that game? This is a Lions team that from the first quarter, we were sat watching, calling out, they're clueless, they don't know what they're doing. And the 49ers let them back in. And not even just a little bit, so to let them in and have some garbage time points. Like Rob made a comment, didn't he, about Matt Stafford's statistics and the fact that Matt Stafford's the most garbage time inflated quarterback that potentially that we're ever going to see. And then all of a sudden, the Lions have got the ball again, driving down with the opportunity to sort of to take the game. So for everybody that's kind of said, oh, the 49ers, they're wonderfully coached, they've got a great team, they're a season or two removed from the Super Bowl. I was looking at that and thinking, well, hang on a minute, are the 49ers actually as good as we think they are?
I don't know, you're saying this about a team that put 41 points up in week 1. Any Kyle Shanahan offense is going to be brilliant. I don't see it. I just think week 1 is an easy one to make silly mistakes when you've scored 40 points and you let a team, get I don't know what, 14, 20 points. I mean, don't forget, up until that fourth quarter, the Lions had got like 7 points or 14 points. They were a long way back. And I know that there was a lot of silly mistakes, but like I said, silly mistakes happen when you're so comfortable and it's so casual because you're just absolutely creaming a team. I don't see it.
Here's how much I disagree as a bit of a frame of reference. I nearly went for the Lions as being the mirage, even though they lost, because I actually think the Lions will not make up 20-point deficits in the third and fourth quarter very often. They will actually probably end up losing by 20 or 30 points a lot of the time. I don't think Jared Goff's the problem, but I said this to, as I've mentioned, I watched week 1 Red Zone and then a number of highlights since in the company of JB and PB. The Lions are doing things in week 1 that teams who have nothing to play for try in week 14 onwards. That was the feel I got. And ultimately, they cannot do the basics well outside of Goff to Hawkinson and a few of those kind of elements kind of work. I think he's a reasonable tight end. I think they've got a better than reasonable quarterback. And beyond that, I think it's shocking. I mean, the 49ers switched off, didn't they? I think it's as simple as that. I think in a game where there was only 3 points, I think maybe minds would have been sharper. And given a week, I think Shanahan will absolutely have those minds sharper. But you know what? We're talking about these as odd mistakes that the 49ers will clean up. Says who? I mean, JB, you may well be looking very smart and sitting pretty after this weekend when the 49ers go and do something like that again. But I think the Lions were probably more likely the mirage than San Fran. So does that round out our week 2 regular season show? What another belter. We've got some brilliant stuff ahead through the season, but let's not say goodbye too soon. Still got 2 things to do. The first of which is our regular pre-tiebreak guessing. So we've got football tonight. Now, because we have a competition where we guess the winner of each game each week, in the event there is a tiebreaker, it will come down to who predicts the winner of this upcoming game, the Thursday night football, and gets closest with the score. So it's a bit of an odd one, this. I mean, Washington against the Giants? I mean, I don't know. It could be high scoring, low scoring. It's got one of those kind of, it could be any kind of game feels about it. But Aldrin, give me your winner and your predicted score and we'll roll from there.
I'm going to go the football team for the win, and I'm going to go 1914.
1914, nice. JB, what have you got for Thursday night football?
I have also got the football team taking the win. 16-10.
16-10, another low scoring. PB, what are you going for?
I am going to go Washington to win, the football team to win. Just doing some quick maths. 34-10.
Wow, you hold Heineke in grand esteem, do you?
Actually, I think Heineke looks all right. I mean, I'm going to go, I'm closer to Phil than I probably am you guys. I mean, it could be a dud, but I'm going to say 27-24 Washington. Does that mean clean sweep for the football team? Is that all 4 of us? I think Daniel Jones will be a revelation, but not quite do enough. There's my bold prediction, being behind Danny Dimes this season. So with that, we start a new tradition today. As we have picked our winners from week 1, the winner of our week 1 pick'em game was JB. You ended week 1 with a record of what? Tell our listenership.
It was JB with 12-4. Then Aldrin got...
That's fine.
You sure? Because Aldrin got 9-7 and Phil was 7-9. And then whoever the 4th person is in this thing got 6-10.
Still pick the Steelers to beat the Bills, though. Thought you'd be kinder to me than that. So as you get to pick
You
our
were
outro
wrong.
music, as you get to pick our outro music, as will be the tradition now each week, that our winner gets to pick the music that we use to say goodbye. Can you give everybody the track you have chosen and any special reasons why?
For all of the Steelers fans out there, we will of course be closing out with Renegade by Styx.
So for Steelers fans used to hearing this in the third and fourth quarter games, that's the song we'll be listening to on our way out. Thank you ever so much for listening, and we'll catch up with you all again in 7 days.
Thanks, everybody.